Well, it's been ages since the last time I asked you which fight you'd like to see be covered as our latest Bleach Battle Analysis topic, but here we are after what feels like much delay. This time, as per public vote, we'll be looking at really the first battle of the major conflict that is the second Quincy invasion, though it does run concurrent with at least one other fight too. But the fight in question today is of course Toshiro Hitsugaya and Rangiku Matsumoto versus Sternritter H, Bazz-B and Sternritter I, Cang Du. As always though, there was a lot of vocal support in the comments for our second place pick, and so the next battle analysis we tackle after this one will be Seijin Komamura versus Bambietta Bastabine, which I'm really looking forward to, I have to admit. But that being said, I'm very excited to break this fight down too, as it's a bit of a weird one. Right off the bat, I'll say that Hitsugaya has rarely had as hard a time in a fight as he does here, even when compared with the serious injuries he received against characters like Xiaolong, or even the brutal defeats he suffered at the hands of Aizen. In my opinion, no battle of his has ever felt quite like this. Never felt quite this desperate before, and that makes things really interesting. So, without further ado, let's dive into this clash of fire and ice, ash and steel, Shinigami and Quincy. The battle that really acted as the opener of the second Quincy invasion, helping to set the tone for what was yet to come. Before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you want to take that support for me another step further, I do have a Patreon as well. And as always, I just want to say an enormous thank you and a massive shout out to everyone supporting me over there on Patreon. I really do appreciate it, and it means so much to me. But if you want to support me in an even easier way, you can go and check out my second channel, Mr. Tomo Talks Games. Maybe give it a subscribe, I'd really appreciate that as well. But no matter how you choose to support me, just know that I'm extremely grateful either way. So thank you all so much. And of course, there will be spoilers for the 1000-Year Blood War arc of Bleach in this video to come. So, like I said, this is really the first major fight of the second Quincy invasion. These early battles all center for the most part on dealing with the subplot of the stolen Bankai, really the main holdover from the last clash. The vast majority of the initial day of this conflict is spent restoring the captain's Bankai and then dispatching of the Sternritter who committed that theft in the first invasion, with only as not really remaining by the time dawn breaks on the second day of battle. Which is why it's kind of weird that Bazz-B is the one to face Hitsugaya here, and that speaks volumes as to the importance that Kubo wanted to bestow on this character. Everyone kind of assumed anyway that Bazz-B was always going to be one of the most important Sternritter, but he barely appeared during the first invasion at all. However, he was given real characterization during the downtime between battles, and so it made total sense for him to be one of the most prominent faces at the start of the next conflict. Pitting him against Hitsugaya makes a lot of sense. They're opposites in more ways than one, with Hitsugaya being generally a cool-headed and calm individual wielding icy powers, while Bazz-B is a loud, energetic enemy brandishing wild and untamed flames. And so rather than doing the mirror matches that the Rankar arc kind of became famous for, maybe Kubo here is instead taking an opposites attract approach. And if Kubo wanted to give Bazz-B more panel time than most of the Vandenreich, what better way to kickstart that than by placing him into a fight he almost certainly wasn't going to be killed in. So this fight does pretty good things, I would say, for the character of Bazz-B, but what about everyone else? Rangiku is involved in this battle too in a minimal way, yet not insignificant enough to the point that she can be ignored altogether. In fact, this battle well and truly highlights the odd role Rangiku plays in the 1000-Year Blood War arc as a whole. I'd argue she is one of the cast members who receives the harshest demotion in this arc, falling all the way from a character with real spotlight and prominence throughout 2/3 of the entire Arrancar arc to someone who is barely a background supporting character. This fight is the closest she really comes to recapturing some of that Arrancar arc glory, and even then, it's cut brutally short. And of course, across the different arcs, Kubo wants to focus on different characters, different vice captains for each major arc. But Matsumoto really does feel like one of the purest examples of someone who went from being a pretty major character to barely having any face time with the audience whatsoever. But it's not just the Shinigami who are being cut down to size. Due to Bazz-B basically taking the reins on this entire battle, his fellow Sternritter Cang Du is almost comically underutilized. Despite Cang being the one who stole Hitsugaya's Bankai in the first place and therefore his grudge match opponent, the battle is kind of over before it really begins once Hitsugaya's Bankai is almost immediately restored. So, while it might have been maybe more accurate to simply call this fight Hitsugaya versus Bazz-B, I think it would be doing a disservice to everyone else involved, and they're at least in it enough to the point where I feel they should be included. Plus, Cang Du is really cool, has a great design, and is absolutely somebody I want to see more of in the anime. I made a joke a while back that Cang Du gets more of a fight in the Thousand Year Blood War arc's anime opening than he actually does in the source material, and while a little facetious, it's still a solid point. Anyway, as the first marquee fight of the second invasion, it's actually pretty long, and moves through several different stages as the fight progresses. There's a real natural feeling escalation here, which is really nice. The fight's lifespan runs from chapter 547 right the way through to chapter 554, though it's broken up substantially along the way, and an argument could be made that it doesn't actually end until chapter 559. Teases of other fights, including Mayuri vs Askin and Kyoraku vs Hashwolf, occur throughout, but the biggest breaks come from the other, slightly shorter but also concurrent fight being Soifon vs BG9. Both this fight and Soifon's fight play out very similarly, and are designed to show the fruits of the captain's training that was taking place during the downtime between invasions, where we saw Hitsugaya return to his swordplay roots and Soifon's strength and endurance tests. While the captains both perform admirably to begin with, it quickly becomes clear that both of them are no match for their Quincy enemies without Bankai, and the tables turn in a particularly dramatic fashion, especially where Hitsugaya is concerned. But who's actually involved in this battle? Well, Hitsugaya is of course the main focus point, attempting to defend the soldiers of his division once the invasion is completed. And he's working together with Rangiku to do so, at least to begin with. Sternritter H, the Heat, Bazz-B is the primary enemy here, getting his first real fight of the series. Bazz-B's fights are really weird for such a major foe. This fight against Hitsugaya is almost too easy for him, and he stomps the captain without much effort at all. But then his second fight, which is against Hashwolf, is a slaughter in the opposite direction, and although he does use everything in his arsenal against Yhwach, you still get the sense that Bazz-B's full potential is never truly realised within an actual even fight. Meanwhile, Sternritter I, the Iron Cang Du, joins the fight roughly halfway through, and at the worst possible time, taking over from Bazz-B to claim his prey. Bazz-B and Cang Du are an interesting duo, and honestly, with their character designs and seemingly diametrically opposed personalities, Kubo could have really had a popular duo on his hands here, I think. Though I suppose in the end the same is true of Bazz-B and Yhwach, which is actually fleshed out. But Bazz-B and Cang seem to be on decent terms, at least as far as the Sternritter go, as they're seen walking together in the aftermath of yhwach's announcement, and Bazz-B watches the end of Kang's fight from afar, though admittedly doesn't help him either. Now, due to this being the first fight focused on in this conflict, there isn't a lot in the way of pre-fight context to wade through before we get to the meat of the battle itself. As the Soul Society prepares for war with the Vandenreich, several of the captains deal with the truth that they no longer have their Bankai. Hitsugaya returns to his division's academy in an attempt to press on forward, beginning by relearning the basics of Zanjutsu despite murmurings from his own officers that he's finished without access to his Bankai. As the Soul Society awaits the next invasion, it comes swiftly and suddenly. Without warning, the very shadows of Seirete itself seemingly rise upwards, Shinigami across the Soul Society watching in horror as the veil is lifted on the Vandenreich's own city, which quickly replaces everything. Seirete's streets, its buildings, they're all gone, replaced with the ice-washed Gothic European stylings of the Quincy's home. As the Shinigami now find themselves isolated and cut off in surroundings that are completely alien to them, they're easy pickings for the Sternritter, who are roaming the battleground. Attempting to organise some kind of defence, the Shinigami rally together to impede Bazz-B, who is charging towards them, but of course they're no match for him, and he unleashes a torrent of fire upon them, seemingly incinerating them all. As Bazz-B remarks that they're too late to stop them and the enemy is already here, he suddenly realises his flames didn't reach the Shinigami. They're all alive, protected by a wall of ice. Hitsugaya arrives with Matsumoto in tow, ready to challenge the Quincy. Unfortunately, as we're right in the throes of the start of the invasion, we're already cutting away from Hitsugaya's battle to help set up Soifon's fight. But this diversion doesn't last long, and a few pages later we're back with the 10th Division once again. Bazz-B realises he knows who Hitsugaya is. This is the icy captain whose Bankai was stolen by Cang Du. This is interesting. Bazz-B is already openly defying orders from yhwach by continuing to engage with Hitsugaya after recognising him. If Bazz-B is after his king's glory at this point, like all Sternritter are, then ignoring his orders seems like a weird way to go about it. That being said, yhwach also revels in creating discord among his men and values those that aren't simply mindless followers. Plus, all the Sternritter that engage in infighting are also going against yhwach's own supposed creed, so it really does seem like anything goes. It's just interesting that later on, when Cang Du challenges him on this, Bazz-B relents so easily. But it's also cool as it kind of implies some background chatter between the Sternritter. Presumably Cang Du told Bazz-B that he stole a Bankai, maybe even going so far as to show him which Bankai it was, and who the captain was that it once belonged to. This is all stuff I really wish we'd been able to see, but of course realistically there's nowhere to fit it in. Hitsugaya formally introduces himself to Bazz-B, and the Quincy does the same, revealing his shrift. The first full chapter of this fight, 548, The Thin Ice, is an intriguing one as it presents Bazz-B's shrift, The Heat, in a totally different way to how we'd see it moving forwards. Here, Bazz-B seems to predominantly just manipulate fire in a pretty standard way, without any of the individual flair that sets him apart later on. Here, he's able to generate flames as well as heat up his own body and control waves of fire with his hands. Hitsugaya and Bazz-B clash with a massive explosion that shatters Hitsugaya's defensive ice wall, sending the officers behind it flying. Matsumoto commands the men to fall back while she and Hitsugaya deal with the enemy. Kubo sprinkles in a little bit of ominous foreshadowing here, a nice red herring to make us think that Hitsugaya is in real trouble this early on. The officers fall back, but as they do, they note that the ice wall Hitsugaya used to protect them is incredibly thin and fragile looking. Has losing his Bankai impacted Hitsugaya's overall strength that much? It certainly seems so at the moment, and the officers question whether or not Hitsugaya will actually be okay. I like this. I think it's clever structuring from Kubo. He begins this fight by kind of hinting falsely that Hitsugaya might be in real trouble here before pulling a switcheroo and proving that Hitsugaya can hold his own after all, before actually revealing with another switcheroo that Hitsugaya is actually in way over his head and pays the price for it I think that's a really kind of clever and refreshing way to structure a fight. But anyway, this early red herring is reinforced as Bazz-B's relentless flames burst through another of Hitsugaya's ice walls, with the Sternritter mockingly telling Hitsugaya to just try and spread more ice in the area. Matsumoto arrives to work with her captain, and it's great to see this kind of teamwork between officers. Although Hitsugaya and Rangiku were major characters in the Arrancar arc, we rarely saw them working together as an actual pair like this. Instead, they'd be fighting their own individual opponents most of the time. But actually, one thing the Thousand Year Blood War arc does very well is highlight the partnerships between captain and vice captain. Anyway, Matsumoto revels in Hitsugaya needing her help, enjoying the fact that he's relying on her. There's something really odd about this scene, and I think it might be the art, specifically this panel of Matsumoto. I don't know if it's just her post-time skip hair, her face shape, or what, but I've always thought this particular shot of her looks nothing like her whatsoever. Regardless, we get to see Hineko activated here for the first time since I think the Fraction battles of the fake Karakura town, which is awesome. But I believe this is also the one and only time it's used in the Thousand Year Blood War arc, unless Zombie Matsumoto uses it against the Privarona Espada, but I can't quite remember. I don't think she does, at least not on screen anyway. But Matsumoto summons her torrent of ash before they proceed with Operation Mille-feuille. I think that's how you pronounce that, I'm not entirely sure, as Matsumoto calls it, much to Hitsugaya's chagrin. The truth of their plan is revealed. Hitsugaya's ice might be thin, but it's all part of their defensive scheme. Operation Mille-feuille is honestly quite an interesting application of both of their Zanpakuto, and a really unique method of them working together. If I know my baking, and I don't, I think a Mille-feuille is like a style of cake or something with numerous layers to it, which of course explains exactly why they chose this name when you see how this defensive scheme actually plays out. With Hineko, Matsumoto creates multiple walls of ash, so incredibly tiny specks of dust essentially, over which Hitsugaya freezes numerous layers of very thin ice. By shouting the command Hineko House, Matsumoto is able to return the ash to her sword, leaving behind densely packed layers of vacuum ice. Bazz-B is able to melt the first layer by coming into contact with it, but thanks to the density of Hineko and how many walls were created by the technique, there will always be another beneath the surface separated by that vacuum space. It's honestly pretty clever and a good use of their combined abilities. It's a little odd that we don't see any of this crop up in Hitsugaya's training, and instead see him relearning his Zanjutsu skills, which don't actually appear to come into play here really whatsoever, but the crux is the same. That Hitsugaya, along with Rangiku's help, has learned how to use his Shikai in a much more intricate and useful way. Hitsugaya mentions that his Hyorin-maru is the Zanpakuto with the least amount of difference between Shikai and Bankai, because it simply comes down to how much ice he can create. I'd personally imagine Byakuya's Senbon Zakura has to be pretty close, as it seems to function in a very similar way and on a similar scale to Hitsugaya's Hyorin-maru as well. But also what's odd about this is that even without Bankai, I'm surprised Hitsugaya isn't considerably more powerful in the Vandenreich city due to the buildings and ground all being covered in a coating of ice themselves. The moisture in the air must be considerable and therefore perfect and ripe for Hitsugaya to take advantage of, but he never seems to. And anyway, in his telltale way, Hitsugaya attempts to leave the fight with a parting jab, insulting Bazz-B's power. The Quincy, enraged, launches a blast of fire at Hitsugaya, but the captain is surrounded by his wall of vacuum ice, seemingly totally protecting him. Opening a split in the wall for a brief moment, Hitsugaya gathers ice around his blade before launching a massive strike at Bazz-B, impaling the Sternritter. If it's feeling a little easy so far, that's because of course it is, and don't worry, things take a turn for the worse very soon. As the next chapter begins, the Shinigami of the 10th Division that Hitsugaya rescued before are in disbelief. the captain actually did it. I like Kubo's consistency with the individual officers. It's not something he needs to do, but it's a nice attention to detail that he commits to on numerous occasions. Clearly the Shinigami had been, with good reason I'd argue, nervous about the captains losing Bankai, but they're elated that it seems like it won't be an issue. Bazz-B has been pinned to a wall and seemingly knocked out, if not killed entirely. Meanwhile, nearby, Soifon lands a massive blow on BG9, something that is noticed by everyone in the vicinity. And I love that Hitsugaya and the others notice that fight taking place alongside them, realizing Soifon has also supposedly scored a victory. This is a much more effective way, in my opinion, of having allies assess the battlefield than simply being able to see each other, as was the case in the fake Karakura town. But as Matsumoto, who is massively underestimating Bazz-B, says they should go and help the other captains, the Sternritter reveals that he's still conscious, annoyed that Hitsugaya is planning on leaving him hanging there quite literally when they're only really just beginning. I love the angle on this. Hitsugaya's massive ice blade piercing the wall with Bazz-B's body pinned to the stone like a ragdoll is a really cool shot and a great unique perspective. But of course, Bazz-B reveals what we all knew all along, that he's barely just getting started, the ice around his body beginning to melt into a slush as a massive smirk appears on his face. Bazz-B reduces the enormous blade of ice to nothing but water, stepping down from the pillar totally unharmed. Although Matsumoto looks shocked by this, Hitsugaya interestingly appears unfazed. He knows his ice better than anyone, so likely didn't expect Bazz-B to be dead from just that strike. We're treated to a very cool shot of Bazz-B removing his tattered Sternritter cloak as they prepare for the next phase of the battle. Bazz-B speaks briefly to Hitsugaya, revealing that the Sternritter scorched by Yamamoto from the last invasion are all still alive. This is interesting as Hitsugaya reacts in a way that indicates he knew Yamamoto struck as Nod Nanana and Bazz-B in the last fight, I guess through their spiritual pressure. But Bazz-B explains in a line that shocked many back in the day and had people scrambling in the community to deduce just how powerful this guy actually was, that the Sternritter only survived Yamamoto's attack because Bazz-B cancelled out Ryujin Jaka's flames with his own. This is a very dubious line at best. Its sole purpose is to hype up Bazz-B as someone capable of completely destroying Hitsugaya, and admittedly that is true, and that is essentially what proceeds to happen, but it's also wise to not take it completely out of context. First of all, Yamamoto doesn't strike all three of them instantly. Instead, we can see from the sequence of events that the Sternritter must either hit him first, or at least land on the ground beside him thanks to the dust cloud before Ryujin Jaka goes off, potentially giving Bazz-B more time to react than you might initially think. And even with that chance, Bazz-B and the others are totally incinerated. We see Bazz-B later on looking considerably worse for wear. So while it's impressive that he presumably blocked Yamamoto's flames with his own, and actually I guess presumably went out of his way to save several of his comrades, saying he cancelled them out is a little disingenuous. It's more similar, I think, to when Shinji Sero totally overwhelmed Grimjo's. He was able to save himself, but just barely. Admittedly, it is of course still very impressive though, with Ryujin Jaka being as all-powerful as it is. But Bazz-B places his hand on the remainder of the ice blade in the wall and turns it to water instantly simply by heating it up with his own body. This is also kind of weird, as I'm sure he already blew up the entirety of that blade earlier when stepping down from the pillar, but oh well. Bazz-B then goes on to gloat that he only needs a single finger to defeat Hitsugaya's ice as the captain flings a wave of it at the Sternritter, but the torrent melts before even coming into contact with him. An even more powerful version, basically, of Harabell's own Herviendo, an ability that Bazz-B doesn't seem to use again moving forward. Suddenly concerned with the way things are panning out, Hitsugaya orders Matsumoto to retreat as he prepares to defend against Bazz-B by creating a wall of finely woven ice known as Ryojin Hyoheki, yet another of Hitsugaya's seemingly endless Shikai abilities. Perhaps they felt they didn't have enough time for another attempt at Operation Mille-feuille, but as Hitsugaya tries to put together a blockade, Bazz-B points a finger at him and, with a crazed look on his face, snipes Hitsugaya through the chest with Burner Finger 1, an ability we as readers would become very accustomed to over the course of the remainder of the arc. This is just a really awesome, simplistic ability. Bazz-B has definitely one of my favourite applications of fire in the entire series, even this late into the game. I love how the burning hot speed arrows appear on his gloved finger, and the attention to detail in that the bolt of condensed fire goes right through the ice wall in front of Hitsugaya before piercing Hitsugaya himself. But this is the moment, the first glimpse of the horror Hitsugaya is about to endure. The fight takes a dramatic turn from this point onwards and becomes a desperate fight for survival against an overbearing enemy. There's a great sense of motion in the next portion of the fight as Hitsugaya turns tail and tries to flee, running away from Bazz-B. Though crucially not out of cowardice in any form, but in an attempt to put distance between them so he can think of what to do next. I love this first panel of Hitsugaya, though for the longest time I thought he was jumping backwards away from Bazz-B, I think due to the speed lines on the ground. But no, he's running away, blood splashing on the ground from his bullet wound. Bazz-B ruthlessly gives chase like a hunter running after his prey, with Hitsugaya creating a massive wall of ice which the Quincy effortlessly slices through again with just his finger. But as he does so, Bazz-B finds himself surrounded by a thick, icy mist. Landing on the ground, Bazz-B uses Burning Stomp, another ability we never see again, to send a fiery shockwave rippling across the ground, dispelling the mist. Again, I like that the little arrows appear on his boot when he uses this power. Of all the Sternritter, Bazz-B is one of the few that has a genuinely well-crafted and well-designed ability set in line with other characters and other races in the series. While many Sternritter have just a singular ability which is often vague and overly complicated, Bazz-B's numerous named abilities stem from one central nexus and make him a much more enjoyable fighter to watch on the whole. Cutting a long story short, he fights like a Bleach character rather than something totally alien. But as the mist dissipates, Bazz-B is surprised to see Hitsugaya simply standing in front of him. Bazz-B comments that Hitsugaya should have used that chance to come up with another trick, but Hitsugaya says he simply didn't have time. However, he did have the opportunity to build a trap, revealing yet another Shikai ability, Rokui Hyoket Sujin. This is a cool move as it feels very Quincy-like. It reminds me a lot of Uryu's Sprenger. But 6 snowflakes appear on the ground surrounding Bazz-B, locking him into place. I like the small detail of how a cuff of ice appears around Bazz-B's wrist, seemingly, I would assume, trapping him in the centre of the blast. A massive plume of ice rises up from the snowflakes around him, designed presumably to trap Bazz-B inside for good. But almost immediately, the plume explodes from the inside out. Using just his finger once again, Bazz-B has decimated Hitsugaya's trap. I love that Kubo really commits to making Bazz-B a terrifying force of nature. It makes this moment all the more compelling. Really, this is Hitsugaya's version of the crippling defeats suffered by Byakuya and Zaraki in the first invasion, and Kubo wants you to know it. As Hitsugaya stares in bewilderment at Bazz-B and how hopelessly outmatched he seems to be, the Sternritter threatens to use 2 fingers against Hitsugaya instead, upping the ante. Now clearly out of ideas and out of pure desperation, Hitsugaya lunges at him, intent on killing Bazz-B using pure force alone, but Bazz-B reacts with Burner Finger 2, striking Hitsugaya with a blast so massive it's reminiscent of Yamamoto's own attack against the Sternritter in the previous battle, dwarfing the surrounding buildings. I love the feeling of futility here, the desperation on Hitsugaya's face, the contortion of both rage and glee on Bazz-B's as he prepares to knowingly wreck the captain. It's almost creepy how fast Bazz-B is able to go from looking like a regular guy to looking twisted and monstrous whenever he's about to unleash a new attack for the first time. I'm jumping ahead a lot here, but I can't help but feel Bazz-B was a little neutered after this fight. Or perhaps it's just he never got a chance to really shine again. I'd have loved to have seen him take on Ichigo or something like that in the second half of the invasion, giving him a proper, balanced fight. Maybe even, the fight against Shinji that we've talked about before. But there's something else I want to talk about briefly before we move on. The disappearance of Rangiku. Did you notice it? It feels pretty conspicuous to me. Hitsugaya told her to fall back, which presumably she did, but I have a hard time believing she'd really just abandon her captain when he's so in need during this specific chapter. The same goes for the other officers of the division. They've also just vanished too. Now, it's kind of revealed what happened to Matsumoto in the next chapter, so presumably she's taken out of the picture extremely quickly in a very small window. Anyway, Hitsugaya is completely devastated by Burner Finger 2. It's a really painful looking image, actually. His eyes wide with shock, an almost paralysed expression on his face. Bazz-B's attack lands true. The entirety of Hitsugaya's torso and even a part of his leg has just been blasted, bleached even by searing hot flame, leaving a really nasty looking burn running all along his body. His sword snapped in two, Hitsugaya collapses to the ground as someone else arrives on the scene. Cang Du finally appears, telling Bazz-B that's enough, as the rule was the captains would be killed by those who stole their Bankai, presumably as a final middle finger essentially to the Gote. Kang's appearance is awesome. I just generally think, in my own opinion, he had a much cooler design than Bazz-B, though both of them do look great. But I have to admit, this does come across as not only opportunistic, but also shameful in a sense, maybe giving us a small insight into what Cang Du is really like. I mean, how long did it reasonably take Cang Du to actually find Hitsugaya once the Vandenreich city had taken over the Seirete? Or was he just waiting in the wings for Bazz-B to do all the work? Regardless, Hitsugaya looks genuinely defeated, lying motionless on the ground as it seems the Quincy have actually won. However, the cliffhanger of this chapter foretells the fight's future, as just as Cang Du arrives, bringing with him Daiguren Hyorin Maru, Mayuri receives a timely call from none other than Urahara himself. He's just discovered how to regain the stolen Bankai. Here we enter the final phase of the fight, but Cang Du arrives, to which Bazz-B says yhwach will punish him for stealing Hitsugaya from him, which is interesting in and of itself. So yhwach cares that a sternritter who puts in the work should be the one to actually get the kill? Whether he truly cares or not is up for debate, but it definitely comes across to me that Cang Du wanted to score an easy kill on a captain by waiting for Bazz-B to finish up first, then using the loophole that he has Hitsugaya's Bankai, therefore he gets to be the one to actually take him out, presumably scoring easy points with his majesty. Cang Du then dumps Matsumoto's body onto the ground from underneath his cloak. Going back to the previous chapter and Kang's first appearance, how Matsumoto is actually supposed to be under there, I don't know. But again, this is a pretty dark scene. I'll be totally honest with you. I think Rangiku might actually be dead here. It's hard to say for sure, but her eyes are wide open, and from the blood splatter on and around her neck, it looks like Cang Du has either cut her throat or stabbed her enough to have, I guess, totally knocked her out. Of course, through zombification and restoration later on, she'd be returned to life either way, but here it does kind of look like she's been killed. There's not really any reason for Cang to have left her alive, especially if he caught her by surprise. But this is just another aspect to the harsh treatment Rangiku receives in this arc. I hope in the anime we at least get a glimpse of Cang Du taking her out, and like I said, it must have been by surprise, or at least I'd assume so anyway. But this is a genuinely hard and emotional scene to watch. Hitsugaya, upon seeing Rangiku's limp body just dumped beside him, looks more childlike than ever as his eyes widen in horror. And this is also a small detail as well, but I love the way Kubo showcases just how callous and uncaring the Quincy are by showing that when Matsumoto falls to the ground, she whacks her head on the floor first of all, showing that Cang really did just sort of dump her onto the ground, not caring about her in the slightest, showing a total callous disregard and disrespect for his enemy. But Cang Du says he found her not far from here and brought her to be by Hitsugaya's side. Knowing she's his vice captain, the Sternritter said he felt they should die side by side. Kubo drops snippets of Cang being an actually interesting character here, even going so far as to give him his own philosophy. Why does he feel that those that live together should die together? Unfortunately, we'll probably never know the answer unless the anime decides to expand on it, but as he introduces himself and his shrift, the Iron, he reveals that's his way of doing things. Then, in a very surreal moment, a Quincy activates Bankai. Admittedly, not the first time we've seen it, but we're far more familiar with Hitsugaya's Bankai than we ever were with Chojiro's, and so to see the wings of Daiguren Hyorinmaru adorning someone else, and them actually saying the word Bankai Daiguren Hyorinmaru is very strange indeed. There is a little mistake here, however. Cang Du says that it must be a first for Hitsugaya to see his Bankai from the opposing side, but Cang Du already used Hitsugaya's Bankai against him in the first invasion. Maybe he just forgot. Anyway, Cang Du goes on to say that it's a beautiful Bankai that has spent its entire life with Hitsugaya, and it's the one thing that he will take from him that will live on even after Hitsugaya's death. For that, Cang Du claims to be truly sorry, getting all philosophical on his defeated enemy. It's hard to know if he's being totally serious or not here. I guess it depends on how much he believes his own motto. He could, after all, simply just be mocking Hitsugaya too, or it could just be a combination of feeling genuine remorse for robbing Hitsugaya of something that he won't allow to die by his side when he dies, and also just making fun of him as well. Cang Du is a very cool character on the surface, and I really do wish Kubo had given him more time to shine. I made a joke when this chapter first released many years ago that Cang Du became very talkative all of a sudden, and it's true. Up until now, whenever we'd seen him, Kubo made a point of showing that Cang Du kept silent in every situation, to the point where that seemed to be his trademark, his thing, with only a speech bubble to represent a pause being shown. And this happened when he faced a renewed Hitsugaya and Rangiku in the first invasion when we first saw his face, as well as when he walked with the other Sternritter after their meeting. Even when Ichigo arrived during that first fight, Cang Du was the only one of the Sternritters shown to again not say anything. And yet for some reason here, when it would actually benefit him to be a ruthless, silent killer, Cang Du suddenly opens up into about the biggest villainous monologue ever. Meanwhile, Kisuke arrives in the 12th Division's headquarters, revealing his method for regaining the stolen Bankai. He transmits a small pill known as the Shineyaku, or Shadow Infiltration Pills, to each captain missing their Bankai, though only Hitsugaya and Soifon are currently engaged in combat. Presumably Byakuya just received this pill in the royal palace and was like, what on earth is this, before suddenly receiving his Bankai again with no issue. Anyway, as Hitsugaya touches the pill, he becomes briefly hollow-fied, also briefly hollow-fying his Reiatsu and the Reiatsu found in his Bankai. This hollow Reiatsu seeps into Cang Du, and his body violently rejects the Bankai, causing it to explode out of his back in a burst of blood. I've said it before as recently as my last video that I really like this explanation for the restoration of Bankai. I think it makes total sense, calling back to the revelations we learned in Everything But the Rain, as well as the very start of the series where we found out that the Quincy hate the Hollows. I just wish it had happened a little later, or that the tables weren't turned quite so immediately. At the same time, it does work. Urahara explains that the encroachment by Hollows not only weakens a Quincy's powers, but also completely decays their souls, leading to inevitable death. This goes some way to explaining how Hitsugaya and Soifon, seriously weakened to the point of near death at this point, are still able to snatch a win. The Hollow Reiatsu is actively working against their Quincy enemies, seriously weakening them. As one of Daiguren Hyorinmaru's wings drops to the ground behind him, Cang Du struggles to understand what's going on. He turns to realise the fallen wing has now returned to Hitsugaya, with the captain slowly rising from the ground. I love the attention to detail here again. All of Hitsugaya's injuries have been patched over by ice, from the enormous trail of ice across his torso to even his knee, which was also burned by Bazz-B's blast. And so the fact that Cang Du and BG9 are so violently affected by this hollow-fied version of the Bankai kind of gives us an insight into how this stolen Bankai thing actually works. We know the medallions utilize a version of yhwach's Sankt Altar power, which basically allows him to steal power, and so clearly the medallions basically do just lift off the Bankai as though it were an upper layer of the Shinigami's power, and then wear it essentially like a tangible item, but the properties of the Bankai, the Reiatsu, the source of where it came from, don't really change at all. Anyway, Cang Du still can't understand what's happening, but Hitsugaya simply wonders if Hyorinmaru wants to return home. Cang Du leaps backwards, attempting to put some distance between himself and Hitsugaya. He claims that the Quincy trained to control the stolen Bankai themselves, which again would have been awesome to see, especially since they must have done so in literally just a few days. But Cang then swoops towards Hitsugaya, his Wolverine-style claws outstretched as he swipes them towards the captain, sending claws of ice trails towards him. Again, Kubo's eye for detail is just wonderfully on display here. I love that the ice that shoots towards Hitsugaya is shaped like Cang Du's clawed weapon. That's awesome. But unfortunately for Cang, the ice diverts moments before it strikes Hitsugaya, and Hitsugaya comments that it's ridiculous to think Hyorinmaru can attack himself. Presumably he's talking about the Bankai attacking itself specifically, as Senbonzakura Kageyoshi demolished Byakuya while he still had access to Shikai. Cang reverts then to using hand-to-hand combat, landing a kick on Hitsugaya, who blocked it with a wall of ice. Cang Du tells Hitsugaya to stop talking as if Bankai has a mind of its own before pummeling him with a flurry of kicks. The final kick, a massive overhead sweep, is strong enough to send Hitsugaya hurtling back into the air above them. Cang Du clearly being extremely proficient in hand-to-hand combat, which is honestly really awesome and something I'd have loved to have seen even more of. But Cang turns to him claiming not to be a believer in pantheism before giving chase. Now, this is a little hard to swallow, and I explicitly remember people thinking Cang Du was just an absolute fool back in the day. Now sure, it's his personal decision to not believe in pantheism, the idea that everything has a soul, but I mean, this is the most ridiculous fictional universe to choose not to believe in pantheism in. And so, clearly, Cang Du doesn't see the Zanpakuto as living beings, but I think that's just ridiculous. You know, the Quincy have been the mortal enemies of the Shinigami for 1,000 years, and even worse than that, they've watched them from the shadows all this time, privy to their most secretive of truths, and yet you're telling me Cang Du somehow still doesn't believe the Zanpakuto have minds of their own. This isn't the last time a Quincy is shown to not really understand or appreciate the bond between a Shinigami and their blade, but this particular example does seem too far-fetched for me. To make matters even worse, Cang Du is one of the few Quincy to actually steal a Bankai, so he's actively spent some time with Daiguren Hyorinmaru. Now, I'm sure Hyorinmaru never revealed himself willingly to Cang Du, but I mean, come on. I guess if we're being generous, Cang Du could specifically be talking about Bankai as a separate entity. After all, it was revealed by Kubo, like I said, that the medallions use a version of Sankt Altar to steal power from their opponents. So really, like we said, they're taking a surface layer version of the Bankai to use, but still, someone hasn't read their daten. I mean, in the latter half of this conflict, Pepe mentions that he knows Zanpakuto have souls. How is this not common knowledge among the Sternritter? If some of them know it, you would have thought they all would know it. And maybe Cang is just choosing not to believe this, despite irrefutable evidence, I would argue, being right in front of his eyes, and it seems like a pretty basic and major part of knowing their enemy. Anyway, with that rant behind us, Hitsugaya finally speaks with Hyorinmaru once again. equally amazed that Cang Du doesn't believe Bankai has a mind of its own. Hyorinmaru replies to him, saying it seems so, and Hitsugaya stands tall at last, his ice dragon looming behind him. It seems to be actually physically materialized, as Cang Du reacts in shock to seeing it himself, which is going to make an awesome visual in the anime. I don't know if this is due to Hyorinmaru being hollow-fied or not, but the dragon itself looks a lot more menacing than before, with a monstrous face and enormous body. Hitsugaya himself has also been hollow-fied partially, wearing a hollow mask over his eye. Even his blade, which was broken in two, has now been repaired with ice. Cang Du realises his remaining wing has disappeared as well, and suddenly desperate, he clamps his hands together and releases an attack called Shejin Zao, the snake claw, towards Hitsugaya. It's a really awesome looking ability, forming the jaws of a snake from reishi from both of his claws, but unfortunately we don't get to see it in action. Instead, Hitsugaya simply lifts his blade towards the Sternritter, and Cang Du looks on in horror as he's frozen completely. Hitsugaya ends the fight with another of his trademark barbs, apologising to Cang sardonically that he couldn't make Hyorinmaru's ice into a pentagram for him. Even if I do think this ending is a little rushed, I mean, I'd have loved to have had even one additional chapter showing Cang Du fighting the hollow-fied Hitsugaya properly. I do like this fight quite a bit. I like how it feels very bitter. Like the two sides really genuinely don't like each other and are trading snide remarks with every chance they get. From afar, Bazz-B was watching the fight play out and remarks how much of a joke it is that Cang Du said he'd take over only to lose, which feels like a bit of meta commentary from Kubo himself. Hitsugaya, having seemingly won, staggers towards Matsumoto's corpse, or at least her unconscious body, his hollow mask crumbling as the hollowification wears off. Before he can reach her, however, the captain collapses onto the floor as an ominous shadow approaches him. And far above, Cang remains frozen in Hyorinmaru's cross. While that's technically the end of the fight in chapter 554, it does sort of continue, albeit in a very frustrating way. Because you see, the battle's not actually over. Cang Du activates his Vollständig, freeing himself from Hitsugaya's ice, arguably making him the winner of the battle overall, since Hitsugaya is now completely passed out and Cang Du is unharmed. But unfortunately, we don't get any kind of continuation, nor do we even get to see Kang's holy form, something else I really hope the anime amends in some way or another. It definitely seemed to me like Kubo planned on carrying on both Cang Du and BG9's fights in some way, before realising he simply didn't have time. Instead, in chapter 559, Cang is inexplicably brought to yhwach's palace, completely uninjured. Kneeling before his king alongside BG9, Cang Du faces the judgment of Hashwolf, who prepares to execute him for losing his fight. This is such a weird sequence, and one I have always had a massive problem with. BG9 even makes a defense for them that makes total sense. They temporarily lost, yes, but they were both revived with Vollständig in such a way that they can continue fighting, and both of their opponents are at the absolute brink of exhaustion and even death. By this logic, Asnot should have also been called to yhwach's palace the moment he was frozen by Rukia, but instead, he gets to play out his fight to the very end. Regardless, Hashwolf moves to strike Cang Du, bringing his blade down upon him, but Cang Du blocks it effortlessly, finally unveiling his Shrift's ability. With the iron, he's able to cover his skin in a layer of seemingly impenetrable metal. Thankfully, the anime has actually already had him use this ability against Hitsugaya during the first invasion, which is a nice addition. But as Cang Du challenges Hashwolf personally, saying it's not hard for him to block his blade, and he won't allow anyone to kill him apart from yhwach, Hashwolf activates his own Shrift, the Balance, enabling him to take Kang's good fortune in surviving that strike and turn it against him. With this, yhwach is able to kill him, bringing his blade down and bisecting the Sternritter almost completely in half vertically, thus killing a perfectly capable and loyal warrior for basically no reason, and then again with presumably BG9's death to follow. And so that's basically it for this battle, Toshiro Hitsugaya and Rangiku Matsumoto versus Bazz-B and Cang Du. It's a pretty solid fight overall with some great themes, excellent action, and just a smidge of a disappointing ending that would act as a harbinger for some of the messier moments to come down the line in the second invasion. Yes, I'm still a little bitter about the end of this fight, and I would love to see the anime rectify it even a bit. Even if they restructure things a little to show the hollow-fired Hitsugaya actually duking it out with Cang Du, maybe injuring him to the point where he has to use his holy form only for him to lose again, would be great, and actually makes sense as to why the Quincy leadership would then consider Cang Du to be a failure. That's potentially a lot to ask though, but that's it for this Bleach Battle Analysis. I really hope you enjoyed it. Up next is Seijin Komamura versus Bambietta Bastabine, which will also be a lot of fun to take an in-depth look at. Let me know in the comments below if there are any other fights you'd like to see, and keep an eye on the community tab for upcoming polls to decide the next topics for both this series and others. Let me know your thoughts and feelings on this battle down in the comments below. Did you enjoy it? Was it a good opener to the second Quincy invasion? And would you have loved to have seen it played out slightly differently in any way? Let me know down in the comments. Make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already. Give the video a thumbs up. Check out Mr. Tomo Talks Games. And until next time, guys, I'll catch you later. And I'll see you then.